In the black hours before dawn on June 6, 1944, while the Atlantic Wall lay silent under mist and drizzle, a German general stood inside his headquarters in Normandy, confident that nothing extraordinary would happen that night. The thick concrete bunkers, the minefields, the steel hedgehogs, the guns pointed toward the sea, all of it had been built to stop an invasion from the beaches. That was where the enemy would come. That was where the war would be decided. Then, suddenly, the night itself began to scream. Engines roared out of the darkness. Canopies exploded open in the sky. Shadows fell from the clouds. And as terrified sentries fired wildly upward, the general received reports so unbelievable he thought they must be mistakes. Thousands of Allied paratroopers were dropping behind the Atlantic Wall. Not dozens, not hundreds. An entire army was falling from the sky. In that moment, the rules of war shattered, and ordinary young men, scattered in fields and swamps, became the key to saving the invasion of Europe. The plan depended on silence, darkness, and men who knew they might never see the sunrise. Thousands of miles away, the decision had already been made. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe would begin not with soldiers charging beaches, but with young paratroopers jumping blind into enemy territory. They were bakers' sons, factory workers, farmhands, teachers, not legends, not supermen. Many were barely 20 years old. On the night of June 5th, they sat inside the metal bellies of C-47 transport planes as rain hammered the fuselage and the engines droned like an approaching storm. Each man carried more than 60 pounds of gear, a rifle or submachine gun, ammunition, explosives, medical kits. Some carried radios that were supposed to guide entire divisions. Others carried nothing but themselves and the quiet terror of knowing one mistake would mean death. Inside those aircraft, fear had a sound. Boots scraped against the floor as turbulence shook the planes. Dog tags clinked against each other. A few men whispered prayers. Others stared at nothing, replaying letters written to parents, wives, sweethearts, letters that might already be final. They had trained for years for this moment, but no training could prepare a human body for stepping out of a flying plane into total darkness over enemy land. They knew German anti-aircraft guns waited below. They knew they would be scattered. They knew they would likely land alone. Still, the men stood when the red lights turned green. Because if they failed, the entire invasion on the beaches would be slaughtered. At exactly the wrong moment, everything began to go wrong. High winds blew the aircraft off course. Clouds swallowed formations. German flak bursts tore through the sky, shaking planes so violently that some pilots thought they were going down. Navigation lights vanished. Drop zones disappeared. The carefully planned airborne assault, designed to be precise, coordinated, and clean, unraveled in minutes. When the jump lights finally flashed green, soldiers leapt anyway, because there was no turning back. Parachutes blossomed like pale ghosts over hedgerows, swamps, flooded fields, and villages filled with enemy troops. Men hit trees and dangled helplessly. Others fell into water weighed down with gear, drowning silently before they could free themselves. Some landed directly among German patrols and were killed before they could fire a shot. And yet, something extraordinary happened in that chaos. Instead of breaking these men, the disorder hardened them. Small groups formed instinctively. Strangers found each other in the dark and decided, without orders, to keep going. A lieutenant with no map took charge because someone had to. A private with a compass became a leader because he knew which way was west. They blew bridges they were never briefed to destroy. They ambushed convoys they hadn't known existed. Every explosion echoed through the night like a whisper spreading fear, not among the Allies, but among the Germans who suddenly realized the battlefield was everywhere. Back at headquarters, German command struggled to understand what was happening. Reports came in from all directions. Paratroopers sighted near villages that were supposed to be secure. Gunfire behind the lines. telephone wires cut, bridges destroyed by men who shouldn't have been there. One officer insisted it must be a feint, a diversion meant to draw troops away from the beaches. Another said it was impossible for so many soldiers to have dropped so deep inland. But as the hours passed, the scale became unavoidable. Over 13,000 Allied paratroopers had descended behind the Atlantic Wall. The defensive system designed to crush an invasion was now being attacked from the inside by scattered, determined, ordinary men who refused to disappear. As dawn crept closer, the German general finally understood the truth that chilled him. The invasion was no longer coming at the Atlantic Wall. It had already passed it. And the fate of Europe now rested not on massive armies, but on isolated paratroopers, exhausted, lost, terrified, who chose to fight anyway. When the sun began to rise over Normandy, its pale light revealed a battlefield no one had planned for. Paratroopers woke in ditches, hedgerows, barns, and flooded fields, unsure of where they were or who was still alive. Smoke hung low in the morning air. Cows wandered through shell holes. Church bells stood silent, their villages already changing hands in whispers and gunfire. Many men had lost their weapons on landing. Others carried rifles jammed with mud. Some had nothing but a knife and a few grenades. Yet everywhere they heard the same distant sounds. German boots on pavement, engines starting, shouted orders. And they understood the truth instantly. They were deep behind enemy lines, they were outnumbered, and no help was coming soon. Fear pressed on them like weight. Training said wait for orders, link up with your unit, follow the plan. Reality said none of that existed anymore. Radios were smashed on landing or soaked in swamp water. Officers were dead. Maps meant nothing when every hedgerow looked the same. One paratrooper later said the most frightening moment of the war was not the jump. It was standing alone at dawn, realizing he might be the only American alive for miles. The temptation to hide, to wait, to survive quietly crawled into every man's mind. But something else burned stronger. They knew the beaches were coming under fire. They knew soldiers would soon storm Omaha and Utah under machine guns and artillery. And they knew that if Germans could move freely, the invasion would fail. So they moved small bands formed without ceremony. A sergeant with no platoon took command of whoever stood beside him. A medic picked up a rifle because there was no one else left. Rank dissolved into necessity. They attacked road junctions because vehicles needed roads. They blew bridges because tanks needed crossings. They set up ambushes with just a few men, opening fire suddenly and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Every shot, every explosion forced German commanders to believe something far larger was happening. To the Germans, the countryside felt alive with attackers, not scattered survivors, but a hidden army. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German units hesitated to move without orders. Officers demanded reinforcements that did not exist. Convoys stalled, unsure which road was safe. A single machine gun firing from a hedgerow could halt an entire column. The Atlantic Wall had been built to face the sea, but now fear attacked from the fields, the villages, even the forests behind it. One German report described enemy forces appearing everywhere at once. An illusion created by men who refused to act small just because they were alone. Among those men were paratroopers who would become legends without knowing it. At La Fière and Sainte-Mère-Église, exhausted soldiers held critical crossings against repeated counterattacks, bodies piling in the narrow causeways as bullets snapped through smoke. Others fought through the hedgerows to silence artillery batteries that could have wiped out thousands of soldiers landing hours later. Many never knew whether their actions succeeded. They only knew they were running out of ammunition, losing friends by the minute, and still choosing to stay. Inside German headquarters, confusion turned into alarm. Orders contradicted each other. Reports clashed. The general who had once dismissed the airborne landings as impossible now faced a nightmare without clear edges. Every road seemed compromised. Every village suspect. The very depth meant to protect the Atlantic Wall had become its weakness. By the time clear daylight broke over Normandy, one truth was unavoidable. The paratroopers had not simply supported the invasion. They had fractured the enemy's ability to respond. And as distant naval guns began to thunder from the direction of the coast, the German command realized they were trapped between two unstoppable forces, the sea behind them, and an army that fell from the night sky and refused to die quietly. By mid-morning, the German general's confidence was gone. Inside his command post, maps were covered in red and blue markings that no longer meant what they were supposed to mean. Units listed as ready could not be reached. Telephone lines had been cut so many times that even messengers were afraid to ride the roads. Reports described fierce firefights led by large enemy formations, yet reconnaissance suggested these attackers were often no more than a dozen men, sometimes fewer. To the general, this was the most disturbing revelation of all. The Atlantic Wall, reinforced with concrete, steel, and years of planning, was being unraveled not by massive divisions, but by individual will. For German commanders, doctrine demanded order. Every movement required permission. Every counterattack had to be coordinated. But the airborne landings destroyed the very possibility of control. When orders finally arrived, they were already obsolete. A battalion sent to counterattack one drop zone ran into another group of paratroopers they had not known existed. Tanks moved cautiously, afraid of ambush, slowing their response until it barely mattered. The general paced, listening to reports that contradicted each other, understanding too late that delay itself had become defeat. What terrified him was not just the presence of the paratroopers, it was their unpredictability. They did not behave like a defeated or scattered force. They behaved like men with nothing left to lose. On the ground, those men pushed themselves past exhaustion into something colder and more focused. Hunger, thirst, and shock blurred into a numb determination. They slept in minutes-long fragments, rifles across their chests, waking at every sound. The hedgerows became prisons of green steel, where visibility was measured in feet, and death came from breaths away. Each step forward meant possibly walking into a machine gun. Each pause meant risking discovery. One paratrooper described feeling smaller than ever before, yet more responsible than at any other time in his life. If he failed, people he would never meet would die on the beach. At key points, that burden turned into decision. At Brecourt Manor, a handful of American paratroopers assaulted a German artillery battery firing directly onto Utah Beach. They advanced through trenches under machine gun fire, coordinating movements on the fly, shouting orders that somehow sounded confident even when they weren't. One man ran out of ammunition and used grenades instead. Another took command simply because no one else could. Within minutes, that felt like hours, the guns were silenced. Far away, men storming the beach would never know how close they came to annihilation, or that they were saved by soldiers who had landed miles from where they were supposed to be. From the German perspective, this was incomprehensible. The general could not reconcile reports of heavy resistance with the reality that these were broken remnants, acting independently, without supply lines or reinforcement. The wall was meant to break the enemy's momentum at the point of landing. Instead, the enemy had shattered momentum itself, replacing it with chaos that favored the bold and punished hesitation. The general realized the cruel irony too late. The Atlantic Wall's greatest strength, its rigidity, made it powerless against men who refused to fight according to expectations. As the hours wore on and the invasion beaches erupted in smoke and fire, the general looked at his maps and understood that no single counterstroke could fix this. The battle was slipping beyond centralized control. Every minute lost could not be recovered. And somewhere in the fields and villages of Normandy, paratroopers still fought on, barely aware they had already tipped the balance of the largest invasion in human history. By afternoon, the paratroopers' war had become one of endurance rather than movement. Ammunition was low. Water was gone. Wounds were wrapped in torn fabric, if they were wrapped at all. Men fought with cracked lips and shaking hands, their bodies hollowed out by adrenaline and fear. The easy optimism of survival after the jump had faded, replaced by a grinding realization. They were still surrounded, still outnumbered, and now fully exposed in daylight. German forces regrouped and pressed back hard, probing villages, firing into hedgerows, trying to crush what they still believed were organized landing forces. The paratroopers knew better. There was no grand formation to retreat into. There was only the ground beneath their boots and the decision to hold it. At places like Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers clung to narrow streets and stone walls as German attacks rolled in again and again. Machine gun barrels overheated, rifles misfired from dirt and blood. Each time the enemy pulled back, the defenders waited, knowing they would return. The sound of tank engines in the distance carried a particular terror. Slow, heavy, unstoppable. Men checked grenades they hoped could stop steel. Some doubted they could. Some doubted they would survive the next hour. But when the moment came, doubt did not matter. They stayed because retreat would mean opening roads to the beaches, and they understood exactly what that would cost. In other areas, paratroopers fought battles so small they never appeared in reports, yet were just as decisive. A lone squad held a farm long enough to block a counterattack. A single destroyed bridge delayed armor during the critical first hours. A radio operator, bleeding and half-conscious, managed to transmit a garbled warning before going silent forever. None of these men knew if anyone would remember their stand. They only knew they were buying time, minutes, sometimes just seconds, for an invasion that depended on delay more than destruction. Inside German command, desperation replaced confusion. The general ordered counterattacks without full intelligence because waiting was worse than acting blind. Yet each movement seemed cursed by delay or ambush. Units arrived exhausted. Supplies went missing. Air support was scarce or misdirected. The Allies had not just landed behind the wall, they had fractured the enemy's sense of certainty. What the general feared most was that, even if he pushed the paratroopers back, the damage was already done. The clock had been stolen from him. As night approached again, exhaustion claimed what fear had not. Paratroopers slumped where they stood, sleeping with fingers still curled around triggers. Some wept quietly for the men who hadn't made it. Others stared into the darkness, listening for footsteps. The fields smelled of smoke, wet earth, and metal. In that silence, they waited, not knowing whether dawn would bring rescue or annihilation. What none of them could see was the tide turning offshore, where Allied forces were finally breaking through, secure enough now that German counterattacks came too late. The paratroopers had not been meant to fight alone for this long. Yet by refusing to fall back, refusing to vanish, they had forced the enemy to fight shadows instead of the sea. And in doing so, they had held the door open long enough for history itself to pass through.